Hi, my name is Diane, and I will be your host today for our specification, pressure file, and scope demo. What is a specification? Well, a specification is where you enter the construction standards for a project. And you can tell that I stressed project there, and you will see why in just a few moments. These standards or specs could originate from an engineer, an owner, project manager, or just your internal company's standards. These specifications provide the information necessary for Vulcan to properly construct your ductwork. First, let's go over some of the differences between previous versions of Vulcan and your present version, Vulcan 6. Pressure files in previous versions, they were specified or tied to a material. In version 6, when you create your jobs, each job at that point you select your material. So you don't have to create a pressure file when you start a new material, for instance like copper or aluminum. You don't have to have a pressure file that's associated with that material. In version 5, you were also limited to the number of pressure files, the number of round and rectangular pressure files. Well, in version 6, not only your pressure files and your specifications, they're unlimited, as well as all the other information that's contained in Vulcan, your seams, your connectors, everything, your projects, your jobs, your items, everything with using the SQL Server database has enabled us to have unlimited numbers of these. Now, the one main difference is that when you make a change in version 5, those changes were carried over globally. In version 6, because each project has its own set of specifications, if you make a change to one, that doesn't mean it will follow through to all of the others. So, in order to demonstrate that, we'll go ahead and get started at this point. You're looking at my tree area. That's the smaller aqua, and the bigger white area is the grid. If we select project 1, and we want to select the pressure specifications to look at, you can see that project 1 has 4 different pressure files associated with it. If we look at project 2 and go to the specifications for project 2, you'll see that there are several specifications associated with project 2. We'll continue down. If we go to project 3 and look at the specs, you'll see again that looks very similar to project 2, but they're not exactly the same. Project 4 and the specifications, it has just one pressure file, and that pressure file is called low. If you had a pressure file called low in any of the other projects that you're seeing here, that will not, and you make a change, it will not follow through. Looking at the last project for West High School and the specifications, you'll see we have 5 different TDC associated pressure files associated with that project. So as you can see, each one of the projects that I have here, out of these 5 different projects, each one of them have a different set of specifications. Now, if you want to use it similar to what you were used to before, then you can set up a project. In my case, I set up project 3 to contain all of the pressure files that I feel like my company will actually use. And looking back at that again just briefly, I've also called it system specification or system spec. That lets me know that this project is the project where I have all of my system specs. So whenever I create a new pressure file, I will do it in this project. When I'm finished doing it in this project, I will also save as default spec. That allows you to save one of your projects as a default. You have the ability to save any one of your projects as a default set of specs. Now, what does that default do? When you create a new project, you have the option, when you set up a new project, of picking where you want the defaults to come from. Do you want to come from the default that we just talked about a second ago? Do you want to start out with a clean built no pressure files at all, no specs, which means none, or do you want to copy it from an existing project? If you gave it a description, if that spec name had a description, then you'll see that in front of the date. So you can see that Project 4, I gave it a description of low, and Project West High School, I gave it a description of TDC, along with my Project 3, I have called that one System Spec. That's just for your own use, just if you would like to know where that specification was derived from, just in case possibly you may have two different engineers that you do work for, and you want to have a project with Engineer A specs and a project of Engineer B specs. Well, then give it a name in front of when you're creating that project so you'll know whose specs belong to which engineer. So we're going to say we're going to copy this Project Diane from default. Now, one thing that is not available when you are copying from a default scope does not have, a default spec does not have any scopes associated with it. So actually this copy scopes is really not valid when you're copying from default. It is valid, however, if you're copying from any existing project that may have some scopes. If you check that box, then those scopes will follow along with it. So we're going to say OK. And now I have a Project Diane. Diane and Project 3 right now, or my default, are identical. If I look at the specification for Project Diane, it looks identical to the other one. So let's say now I want to add a pressure file. So if I want to add, all I need to do is press the Add button. It puts the word New in the box. At that point, you would just type in the new name. I can press refresh so that it'll redraw this screen, and now I have a low pressure file associated with the Diane project. If I look at the tabs across the top, rectangular, round, and oval, you'll see that I have no size information. And the reason I don't have any size information is because I did an Add button. Had I done a Copy button, then whatever was copied, whatever was in the existing one I'm copying from, will now become a part of the new one that gets created, and you can then make your changes so you don't have to do as much information. So for example, if I select 4-inch water gauge and look at the rectangular tab across the top, I have 3 different size ranges. Well, if I go back to pressure, and now the 4-inch water gauge, the one I want to copy from, is the highlighted one. If I say Copy, then it'll put the word New again there. At that point, you would just type in whatever the name of that pressure file is. Again, you can press the refresh button and it will put that information in order. So now the 4-inch and the 6-inch are identical. So if I look back at the tabs again, you'll see I have those 4 size ranges. So you have a choice of adding a new pressure file, which means you will set that entire pressure file up totally, or you can copy from an existing one and start with some of the information and then go back to that pressure file that you just copied from, or the one that you just created from, and modify it in whatever manner you need to. Again, if I want to give this a name, I can just call this a name of, let's say, Engineer A. Now I go on to the Properties page. You have choices here on options. They're pretty self-explanatory, whether or not this particular pressure file allows joint and intermediate reinforcing and rod reinforcing. What does use same angle on both sides means? That means if you had a piece of duct and it was 60 by 30, and on the 60-inch side it required angle reinforcing. If you have this checked and the 30-inch side did not require reinforcing, it would get the identical reinforcing that the 60-inch side receives. If the 60 by 30 on the 30-inch end it required reinforcing and it was different than what was on the 60-inch end, again, if you are doing same angle for both sides, then it will get the largest angle all the way around. You also have a choice of whether or not you want to specifically pick seams. Designate a specific seam for your rectangular fittings and duct. Same thing with your round, oval, fitting, pipe, spiral, and gore. A new option in version 6 is to select a seam from each individual cell at each individual size range, just as you do for your connector. So if I uncheck this, then when I go over to the rectangular or the round or the oval tab and I right click, just like it says at the top, right click on a cell to modify it, I'll have a box of seam information just like I do connector information. So you have a choice there of picking a seam per size range, or again just going back to the properties page and picking specific seams for this entire pressure file, regardless of what the size of the fitting or duct is. Duct styles, those are pretty much the same, self-explanatory as they were before. We'll go back onto the rectangular, and again we'll start with the fitting column, and we'll right click, and at this point this is where you can make changes to that 6-inch water gauge. Do I want to change to a different seam? To a different gauge? Do I want to change to a different connector? Whatever the information that you need to change, at that point you just do it on a size by size basis. And when I'm finished, I'll go on to the next size and continue making any changes that I have for each and every one of these size breaks. Now, what makes you create new size breaks? Well, if you will press your F1 key, it will bring up a screen on Help. In this information on Help, it actually will tell you why you need to add size ranges. There are 3 things, actually 4. In our Help there's 3, but in reality there are 4. Did a gauge change? Did a connector change? Or did reinforcing change? And the 4th one, if you have the seam selected per size range, did the seam change? If any one of those changes, then you do need a size range break, just like you see on this screen here. So remember also to use the F1 key to bring up context sensitive help. Where you are in the program will actually bring up a help screen. When you're finished setting the entire pressure file up, all you need to do is press the OK button, and now you have information associated with the 6-inch water gauge. If I want to add a new length column, all I need to do is say add a length, and I can say 9999, and now it will ask me where do I want to copy from. I can copy from any column, a fitting column or any other length columns that may be here. So I'll say 60 and copy, and now I'll have a 999 and a 60, and they're identical to each other at the moment. When I am finished, again, on any one of the tabs across the top, if I want this set of specs to be my default, all I need to do is say save as default spec, and then it will save that specification. And that specification does not mean it's just this one pressure file. The specification means it saves all of the pressure files that you see here in one set of specs. And again, you can save as default from any screen. Each screen has those items on it. Okay, so now at this point we'll go ahead and leave the pressure files and specifications, and we'll go on to scope information. I'm going to highlight a job 3, project 3, and job 3, and let's see if there's any. Well, let's go to job 4. Job 4 has a whole lot more sets of scoping information. So we're going to go on to some scopes, and I just want to show you how you can set up scopes. There's 3 places when you create a project at the project level, which is when we created the Diane project. If I modify, there are places here, and remember I said if you copy from the default spec, you will not have any scopes follow through. If I were to go back to and create a new project and call this New, and I'm going to copy from, let's just say I'm going to copy from my system spec, my project 3, and I want my scopes to follow. Then I say OK, and now when I modify new, you'll see that I already have scopes associated with this new project that I just created. So you can add ones, I can add new ones. All I need to do is press the little ellipse button to the right of each one of the scopes and add the new information. We'll just call this DG and say OK. And so now from my drop down list I have all the drawings that I have created. Same thing with the floor. If I want to create a new floor, I can just type in the new floor name and enter, and then when I look at my list I'll have several different floors that may have come from the project that I copied from. We have two user definable scopes. That's up to you to take the place possibly of your previous sketch and piece name, or you may use it for a zone, or you may use it for, let's see, just any information that you may want to designate sets of scoping information. For instance, you may want to use a particular scope so that you can group and identify or filter, and I'll show you what I mean about sorting and grouping and identifying with your scopes. So the first place again that you set up your scope information is on the project level. I'll say OK. And the second place is when I go in and create a new job. At that point, I'll say OK. And when I want to add an item to that job, the very next place that I can set up the information about scopes is at the job setup specifications or job setup options. Here again is where I will select or add any scopes that I may be using for this particular set of items. So I'll just select whatever it is I need here, and when I'm done I'll say OK. This means that I have selected the scopes you see here for the next set of fittings that I take off. So if I end up starting to take off some fittings and enter in dimensions, if I were to press the Scopes tab, you'll see all the scopes that were associated with it. This is the third place that you set up scopes. By using the three little ellipse button, the three little dots, that's an ellipse, you can add new scopes at this point, or you can just change scopes. So let's say you've got 10 or 20 fittings that are a specific scope, and now you're ready to start a different scope within that same job. You just come into either a fitting by fitting basis and change it, or you can make your change here, and when you say save as job default, that means that the new scopes that you just selected for this item and any subsequent items that come thereafter will use these same scopes. If I don't say save as job default on this screen, it will just use the scopes for this particular change, whatever I made here. And let's go ahead and change one of these. We'll call it a filter room, and I'll go back to input and I'll say OK. And when I do another fitting, the user definable scope will not be filter room, it will be back to the rooftop, because I did not say save as job default. So if you want to change midstream for just one item, do it here and don't select save as job default. But if you want this item and your next 10 or 20 or 30 or however many items to use those same scopes, then say save as job default. We'll say OK to this screen, and when I go back to the grid, you'll see that I have the two 990-degree elbows, and they have one user. They're the same scopes with the exception of that user definable. So let's go a little bit further in project 3, job 3. no, I'm sorry, job 4, it has a lot of scoping information, and I want to drag a heading to group by that heading. So what that means is you want to sort, or you want to group some information that goes along with a floor or a drawing or any one of these columns that you see. It doesn't necessarily have to be a scope. I'm just demonstrating scopes today, so I'm going to drag, holding that down with my left mouse button and dragging it up, I release the drawing scope. When I go back to the beginning, you'll see that now it will have put information under each drawing, so I can actually expand the little plus and it will tell me all the items that are associated with each and every one of the different drawings that I have here. So that's how you can group and sort information. So let's just say I don't want that any longer in that area. We're going to let it loose. And now my drawing is back to where it was. If I wanted to just sort within this grid, all I need to do is press the little down, just press the little up buttons, and it will go ascending and descending. And you can do that with any one of the headings as well. So I'm going to drag my drawing back in front of my floor and let go. So as you can see, you can group and filter and identify different drawings, floors, any information that you so desire on the screen itself. Well, I hope that this has cleared up any kind of questions that you may have about specifications. Just remember, specs are project dependent. If I have a low in a pressure file from one project, that low does not follow through to any of the other projects from that point on. If I make a change in one of my projects, let's just go back to new for example, and if I make a change to my spec, any one of the changes here does not mean that if I change like to the 4-inch water gauge and make a change here, that 4-inch water gauge that's in this file will be the same as the one that's in the Diane. They are different. And again, one other thing to remember, once you set up pressure files in a specific project and you want to use them over and over, save it as a default. And then when you're creating new projects, you can either copy from the existing project that you know you set up all the specs from, or you can copy from default. And that concludes